Channel 4 News with 5-time Emmy Award-winning anchor, Ron Burgundy. Cham Kine Sports. Rick Tamlin Weather. And your reporter in the field, Brian Fantana.
It's Channel 4 News at 6 o'clock.
Welcome to Channel 4 News, everyone. So today we're going to be learning about persistent, oscillating, and geographic wind shifts. I know, it's so exciting. And their tactics. So as I mentioned before, there are 3 types of wind shifts, and I'm going to get you guys to sort of guess what they're like. Now first we have the oscillating wind shift, and would anybody like to take a guess? Zoe.
It's a wind shift that follows a back and forth kind of pattern.
Yeah, no, it's exactly like a metronome, and I have a diagram here to sort of demonstrate that. See, it'll shift from one position to the other position repeatedly, and due to that, you're going to be able to head up, or you're going to have to bear off. Would anybody like to guess what a persistent wind shift is? Chris?
Is it where a wind shift keeps shifting in the same direction over the course of the day?
Yeah, it'll repeatedly clock in the same direction. And as you can see from this diagram, it'll start off at the blue position, change to the purple position, and go to the red position. And this is all theoretical. And finally, would somebody like to guess what a geographic wind shift is? Madeline.
Does that have something to do with like large land masses and their effect on like wind next to water?
Yeah, so like if you have a big building in the way, wind will funnel around the building. And when it's coming back, it'll be in a different direction. There's going to be an area of low pressure in the middle and 2 areas of high pressure on the outside. Also, geographic wind shifts can be due to heat differential. And this is going to be called the thermal effect. And this is seen all throughout Ontario. Anyways, we're going to move on to the Tamlin Weather Report. First, we have oscillating wind shifts. And oscillating wind shifts, like I described before, are like a metronome. They'll shift back and forth repeatedly. You'll either be lifted or knocked. And if you don't know what lifted and knocked are, pretend that there's an imaginary line at 180 degrees, and you're sailing up at either 170 or 190. When you get lifted, you'll be able to sail at 175 or 185. When you get knocked, you'll be sailing at, let's say, like 160 or 200. These sailing lifts will allow you to point higher on the race course and get to the upwind mark faster. Now, it's really important that you watch for pressure on the race course. As you can see, like when you're in your boat, you're going to look out and you're going to see ripples on the water. And these ripples are areas of high pressure, and you'll be able to tell that the wind is going to shift. That's why it's also really important to have a wind indicator. A wind indicator will sit on your mast and tell you by how much the wind has shifted and how you should adjust your sail and how you should adjust your boat. So that'll tell you whether you're lifted or knocked. Now, these wind shifts can come in phase, which are regular wind shifts. So it'll repeatedly clock back and forth. Or it can be out of phase, and this will be in mixed conditions. And it'll sort of tie in with the conditions that I'm going to tell you about later. And if you have a compass on your boat, this will allow you to be able to tell the patterns of the wind before you start your race. So you're going to come out about half an hour before your race starts. You're going to get out on the water, and you'll do your practice tacks beforehand. And the wind will repeatedly shift in that time period. And with your compass, you'll be able to tell that the wind's coming at, 170 degrees and 190 degrees. So when you see the pressure on the water, which will come in the form of ripples, you'll be able to tell that the next one's going to be around 190 degrees, right? Now, to be fair, conditions will not always be perfect. And it can come at different degrees each time, so you need to be very wary of this. Next, we're going to talk about persistent wind shifts. So if the wind is shifting to the right, initially you're going to want to go right. And vice versa. If the wind is shifting to the left, initially you're going to want to go left. And this is just basically the tactics of these wind shifts. It'll all make sense later when I go show it on a diagram. Like I said, the wind will be shifting in one direction repeatedly. If it is veering or clocking, the wind is shifting to the right. If it's back shifting, the wind is shifting to the left. And these are just simple definitions for your benefit. If you see that you're being knocked, then immediately you should tack over, so that you're suddenly being lifted and you will get to the upwind mark quicker. Next, I'm going to tell you why it's so important that you don't bang corners. So you're really not going to want to separate yourself from the fleet. This is all theoretical and it's just perfect conditions where this happens. So if you see that the wind is shifting left, then you're going to want to stay to the left of the fleet. If you see that the wind is shifting right, initially you're going to want to stay to the right of the fleet before you tack over onto your ley line. And this is really important if you don't have perfect conditions and you mispredict. Then you're close enough to the fleet that you can catch up and you don't have a really bad race. Finally, we're going to talk about geographic wind shifts. And these are really cool because the further offshore you are, the more predictable the wind is. Whereas the closer to shore you are, the less predictable it is. But with the next few points that I'm going to tell you, you should be able to theoretically predict how the wind is going to move. So it's really cool because the shoreline will actually funnel the wind. So think of it as a big, long tube of water, almost, or a tube of air. It'll go and then curve across with the shoreline. So it'll just funnel it in that direction. Also, wind will shift around obstacles. So pretend you have a really big mountain right there. Wind will come around it, hug the mountain, and come out on either side. So there'll be an area of low pressure and two areas of high pressure on either side. This also happens with buildings and cities. So if you have a gigantic city in the way, it'll funnel around it. So pretend that you have Toronto and how there's the gigantic downtown core. It'll funnel around the downtown core and come out on angles on either side, when initially the wind was coming from the north. Finally, there are thermals, and this plays a huge role in Kingston, where you'll be racing later on this year. Thermals happen when it's really, really cold at night, as it tends to be in Canada. And during the day, the sun will come out, and it'll heat up the land. The reason that it won't heat up the water is because water manages to retain its heat better than the land does. The land will heat up, and wind tends to go from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. Now, cold air will be high pressure, and warm air will be low pressure. So let's say the wind started off in the north during the day, and there's a landmass to the west of us. During the day, there will be a persistent wind shift that goes from the north to the west due to the effect of a thermal. And this plays a huge role, as I said earlier in Kingston, because earlier on in the day, it'll be coming from a certain direction and it will shift. A really cool way to be able to tell if there's going to be a thermal is if you look up in the sky and you see these popcorn-like clouds. Now, I know it sounds really funny in general, but these popcorn clouds will be everywhere and you'll know them immediately, and they'll be fast moving as well. As I mentioned earlier, this is the funneling effect, where the wind will come from one direction and funnel around land. And this is what happens when there's a mountain or an obstacle in the way of land. Next, we're going to talk about tactics, and this is how you stay ahead, San Diego. So this is the general race course with Ron Burgundy up ahead, and no matter where you start on the start line, if the wind is consistent the entire time, no matter how many tacks you take, it'll always be the same distance to the top mark. And this is just simple geometry. And you can see it on the next slide. There's the green path over here that, let's say, our little boat's taking. It'll take the same amount of grid spaces for the green boat to take the green path as the green boat to take the red path. And this is really important during racing. Okay, so next I have a diagram of a persistent wind shift. Pretend that it's coming from this direction initially, and it's shifting left, right? So I'm gonna get you guys to sort of guess which path you should theoretically take to have the fastest route to the top mark. So you have to think, with different time intervals, the wind will shift from, let's pretend like that's 170 degrees to 180 degrees to 190 degrees. So really easy. As I said earlier, you have to remember that if the wind is shifting left, then you head left, and if the wind is shifting right, then you head
Right.
So initially, which direction should the boat head in? Yeah. Yeah, initially it should head to the left. And it'll have this sort of like parabolic motion on the boat where you start off here, and while the wind is shifting, it's actually going to get knocked. And it's really counterintuitive in this way, right? But you can actually tack before your ley line, which is really cool. And if you don't know what a ley line is, it's the perfect degree that you should tack over so that you can get to the top mark. And you do it by like, you're sailing along, and if you look over your shoulder and you can see the top mark, that's how you know that you should sort of tack over. It's actually a really easy way to do it. It's not always perfect, but it's pretty close. So you'll be sailing along in a parabolic motion, right? You're gonna repeatedly get knocked. And then you can tack over, and you'll get lifted right up to the mark. And this course will be faster than if you lift yourself immediately, right? Get lifted immediately, then you're gonna have to tack over and you're gonna get knocked. Then you can tack over again, and you'll get lifted, and you'll tack over again, and you'll get knocked, and this path will be significantly longer than if you head left initially. And you can see this perfectly in the next diagram. Right? Where this boat tacks over immediately, gets lifted, then has to tack back over, and it's really slow. Whereas the red boat over here tacks, gets knocked immediately, then tacks over again and gets lifted, right? And this is a really easy way to remember it. Next, we have the oscillating wind shifts. And this is when it repeatedly shifts back and forth like a metronome, like I said. So how do you guys think that you should attack this course? Do you have no idea?
Pretty much.
Okay. So what you should do is every time that it shifts, you need to tack over to the tack where you're going to get lifted. And if it's perfectly periodical when it shifts, then you can actually get lifted all the way to the mark, and it'll be significantly faster than if you sail the nocks every single time. This is why I stress that it's so important to have a wind indicator, because you can tell when the shifts come in. So if you don't have a wind indicator, then let's pretend Bob over here will be sailing the knocked course repeatedly. He'll also not be paying attention to his ticklers, obviously, and he probably won't have a compass as well. So Bob over here is probably going to come last in the race. And like, whatever floats your boat, but I bet that you probably want to come first. Sort of a natural instinct. And we'll pretend like this is Evan over here. If you have your wind indicator, you can sail up at higher degrees every single time. And you can see this in this diagram right here. The blue boat, Bob, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't paying attention to his wind indicator. So obviously he's going to be significantly far behind the red boat, which paid attention. And it'll get to the upwind mark before everyone else. As I said earlier, stay classy.